Good morning. I want to talk with you about a concept that is pretty familiar to all of us. If you've gone to church more than 2 times, you've likely heard the word evangelism. And, I suppose that's a word that is actually really quite simple in its meaning. If you go get a dictionary and look it up, it simply means to share good news. Right? It doesn't even necessarily have an overtly religious connotation. Right? If you were a person who was alive in the first century, you might use the word Evangelizo to, talk about the good news you got about, a new job or something. All right. Now, in a religious context like this one, it's come to mean something more. Usually, we use it to talk about sharing specifically the good news about what Jesus has done, about what God, through Christ, has achieved. And we do that in various different ways. And I'm going to give you guys a second. I really would like you to think for just a moment about what kind of connotations that word has for you. What do you associate with that term, evangelism? Maybe it means, Bible studies at the kitchen table. Maybe it means door knocking. Anyone think of that? If you've been around for any length of time, perhaps you associate it with the Jewel Miller film strips. Anyone remember that image up there? Maybe it's a gospel meeting, right? Often, churches tend to associate evangelism with some program that they have used for a long time, or maybe the program that they went through when they were young. All right. I would suggest, though, that we need to sometimes be reminded that evangelism is simply sharing good news, right? All of those things we talked about, whether it be door knocking or Jewel Miller film strips or, sending out flyers or pamphlets or whatever the case may be, that's not evangelism, right? That's just a method that you've decided to use, right? That's a way that you have tried to get that job done. And there are actually any number of good ways. Now, one of the things I want to say at this point is maybe some of you recognize the things that I mentioned a minute ago, and you sort of think of those as maybe older fashioned ways of doing that. Maybe you think, back in the 50s or 60s or whatever, whatever tens you want to pick that you most closely associate with it, that worked. All right, but that old-fashioned stuff is no good anymore. Well, certainly I would be the first one to say that whatever we're doing, we ought to use the most effective approach. Okay, but let me add that, not 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago now, I was talking to someone who knew about a church in Colorado, where a couple of their members still use the Jewel Miller film strips, not the film strips, I think they use a movie these days. But, they use that method and baptize, 5 or 10 people every year. So I bring that up because I don't, I've kind of listed those, and I don't want you to associate that list with sort of a negative connotation. Okay. And maybe we should add that using a method is better than not using any method or just doing nothing, which is often the option that churches who label that old stuff as old-fashioned will do. Okay. Now, there is something that I think we should probably touch on when we think about some of the methods we're going to use for evangelism. And that is that oftentimes we want to use sort of a numbers approach. All right, and maybe you've heard of this approach in sales. Has anyone ever done any sales? A little bit? And at some time in that sort of training, did anyone ever tell you, look, there's a certain number of people that are going to respond positively? And so, what were you supposed to do? Right? If it was 1 in 100, or 3 in 1,000, or whatever the number was going to be, right? You just know you got to hit your numbers and everything will be fine. Right? And so if you know 3 in 1,000 are going to buy my whatever it is, and I need to sell 15 a day to make money, then what do you got to do? Right? It's just going to be work the numbers, right? I've got to hit 5,000 people every day in some way, shape, or form. And, I can pretty much count on a certain number of results based on that. Right? And that's fine. And some people have heard sort of that logic and said, well, okay, then perhaps with evangelism, what we ought to do is, whatever the number is, if it's going to be 5 in 1,000 or 1 in 100 or who knows, right? Whatever the number is, we're just going to work the numbers. And I dare say you would have some effectiveness that way, albeit less these days than in the past. But there are some serious barriers, though, to using those methods. I'll tell you just one. When we lived in Halifax, we lived in a small neighborhood, and there are some organizations, religious groups, who do an awful lot of door knocking. Right? And whenever they come to my house, I'm happy to have them. I invite them in, I let them, I chat with them for a while. That's great. But I noticed that in my neighborhood, I would see these groups out around, and I often wondered, why have they never come to my house? Until one day I was driving my car, and I was driving up, and I watched these couple young guys walk up to the house, and they went up to the door, and they did this. I'm not joking. Now, I don't know if you can't hear that, that's why. You're not supposed to. No one could hear it. So they knocked really light and then, move off down the driveway and carry on to the next house. Because they were working the numbers. Okay, they were supposed to hit 50 houses every day. And they thought to themselves, it slows us down a whole lot if people answer the door at those 50 houses. So what we can do to make this a little easier on everybody is just really be as quiet as possible. Now, that's probably not the best approach. I will, though, say that there is something important to be said for reaching people. Okay, on the day of Pentecost, Peter preached to who knows how many 100,000. At least one, perhaps more. Okay? And on that occasion, 3,000 were baptized. All right? And so, if Peter didn't believe, or if the Holy Spirit didn't believe that you should share the gospel with a lot of people, I don't think the Holy Spirit would have orchestrated that situation the way that it was orchestrated. But I think sometimes that can do us a disservice, because we think if I'm going to do evangelism, I have to find a way to reach hundreds or thousands if it's going to be effective. And so we kind of look at our situation and go, well, I can't reach thousands of people, so I guess I can't do it. Which I don't think is true. By the way, there are ways that we can reach lots of people. that'll be for a different lesson, okay? This is going to be what is evangelism, not how is evangelism. Before we ever get to talking about the method, we have to ask whether or not evangelism is important. Right? Is evangelism important? What do you think? Yes? No? Yes? It's important? How important is it? Let me illustrate it this way. I have a friend who recently recounted a story from his own life. Goes all the way back to 1996, right, which I'm pretty sure is only 5 or 6 years ago. At least that's what it seems like to me, but apparently it's longer. So back in 1996, my friend, who weighed about 240 pounds at the time, wasn't what you'd consider, a picture of good health, went to the doctor. The doctor said, you have type 2 diabetes, and you're at risk of heart disease. You could be in real trouble. And so my friend, who weighed 240 pounds and who thought, being healthy is kind of important. I care about it a little bit. All of a sudden thought, maybe eating healthy and being healthy is really important, that I should care about it a lot. And so he made some changes, and now, and for the last, 25 years or something, has weighed about 180 pounds, and made regular exercise and healthy eating a part of his life. Now, I tell you that story to illustrate that how important a thing is makes a big difference. Right? If you would have asked my friend, is being healthy important back in 1995, before he went to the doctor, I bet he would have said yes. Right? But to him, at that time, it wasn't important enough to actually do anything. Right? Until all of a sudden it mattered to him, because the doctor told him, you're really sick and your health is in serious danger. All of a sudden, now if you ask him, is being healthy important? Right? His answer is still yes, but it's a different kind of yes. Right? It's a yes that comes with a whole lot of changed behavior. And so, we have to ask again, is evangelism important? Right? And is it that kind of important that we're going to do something about it? And I would suggest, yeah, it is. Of course it's that important. So let's ask why. Right? Why is evangelism important? What do you think? It saves souls.
It's a matter of life and death.
It's a matter of life and death.
It's a commandment from God to go into the world and teach the gospel.
We have a command from God. Sure. In Isaiah 59, verses 1 and 2, Isaiah says to the people there, their sin has separated them from God. And that's true of all people. Sin separates us from God. Separates us now in this life, but more importantly, it separates us eternally from Him. And although this would be a whole nother sermon, okay, we could have just a lesson on the implications of being separated from God, but if you just think about this one fact, that every single good, comfortable, enjoyable thing that you can think of, and that everyone experiences, right? Whether it was the sunrise this morning, or the cup of coffee you had, or the comfortable chair you got to sit in while you woke up, the bed you slept in last night, every good thing comes from God. And therefore, total separation from him would mean every good thing is gone. There's nothing good ever. Not 1 second, not one moment of good. That's a horrible situation for anyone to find themselves in. Being separated from God is not something we want to experience, not only for eternity, but guess what? In this life, here and now. And I'm not going to belabor this because we've talked about it for a number of other weeks. But many of the things that we look around us and see and observe that something is seriously wrong with the world in which we live, it's because of separation from God. It's because people are engaged and wrapped up in and dominated by sin, and they can't get free from that. And that's not a good situation to be in, again, either physically right now or eternally. And so because of all that, evangelism is important. People need to know that there's an option. That the world can be different, both now and for eternity. And so if we have established that evangelism is important, the next thing we ought to kind of go back to is that evangelism is just sharing good news. Right? The good news that the world doesn't have to be the way it is, that Jesus died to free us from sin. And that can take all kinds of forms. I've got another question for you, and it may seem unrelated, but you'll see in a second. Has anyone ever tried any clothing item that's made out of merino wool? Yes? No? Some of you are like, what in the world is that? Okay, well, it's a wool that comes from merino sheep, and it's quite different from the wool that you would normally experience. The things that are made out of it has all those good things we like from wool. It's warm, it insulates well, but it's not itchy, not in the least. All right, it wicks water really well. That's a normal wool thing as well. But I ask you that question because if you've tried something made out of merino wool, you're really impressed. You're like, man, this is comfortable, it's warm, this is amazing. All right, and if you were, I don't know, going skiing with some friends or working outside or whatever the case may be, and some of the people around were cold and uncomfortable, you may say to them, you could get these socks made from merino wool and your feet wouldn't be as cold. Just because you've tried it and it was so good that you're like, hey, this is a really cool thing, you should try it. It'd be the most natural thing in the world to do. Who's done that with, I don't know, maybe a particular product for your car? Or a restaurant that you went where it was really, really fantastic. Have you ever done that before? When you're with your friends, today I'll bet you this will happen a little bit. I'll bet you there'll be people today debating about which football team is best. And one group will have all the reasons why their particular team is the greatest, and then another team will have all the reasons why, right? We do this totally naturally in conversation all the time. We tell somebody why something is good. Right? We tell them here's why I like this. Here's what it can do for you. We probably do it 10 times a week. But guess what? Evangelism is just telling somebody something good. It's just sharing good news. It doesn't have to have a special program. It doesn't have to involve, hundreds of people or hundreds of dollars. It's just, hey. Right? And so when I'm talking with someone and it comes up that they're struggling in their life with, relationships or stress or balancing their work and their family. I'm going to tell them about Jesus. And I'm not going to try to memorize this long, detailed thesis about, that includes history and geography and all. I'm just going to say, hey, Jesus is good, and here's why. Here's the change it made in me. If you have some idea at all about why you're a Christian, and I hope you have some idea, right, about why you're a Christian, I hope you could justify that, then that's all you need to do. And sure, I get that, you're afraid maybe it'll go somewhere else, that they'll challenge what you believe. But, most people, number one, are not going to do that. And number two, if that does happen, then it's as simple as saying, hey, I don't know about that, but let me check it out and we can talk later. And so you can just have normal, simple conversations with people. And I would suggest to you that if they're people you know, and if they're people that you're in a natural situation with, you'll likely have better success than if you went and knocked on 200 doors. Because those 200 people, they don't know who you are. They don't have any, you've got to go through a whole bunch of steps before you can get to a meaningful conversation. Jesus just asked us to go and make disciples. In Acts chapter 8, another, the two passages there. In Acts chapter 8 and verse 4, it says the Christians were scattered. Paul was after them, right? So the Christians had to run away, so Paul didn't arrest them. And it said, as they went, what did they do? Does anyone remember? They preached the word. Right now, I'm guessing a little bit because I don't have a time machine. And so, in preparation for this, I wasn't able to go back in time and see what happened exactly. But I highly doubt that most of those Christians who were scattered and went about preaching the word, got up on some kind of a lectern and started speaking to people in a large group. I just doubt that's the way it happened. Probably they went and talked with people that they met, that they worked with, that they were around day to day. And that proved in Acts chapter 8 to be highly effective. Now, in a short time, a few weeks, we're actually going to have, and this is why, okay, I didn't get into a whole lot of the how, but in a few weeks, we're actually going to have a meeting where we're going to sit down and try to come up with some ways that we can share good news. And when we do that, by the way, leading up to that over the next few weeks, it's possible that I may preach on this a couple more times. But when we do that, one of the reasons that I wanted to present this lesson was so that you would understand that, hey, sharing good news can be really simple. And there are any number of ways to do it. And that's what I want you to be thinking about. What are those ways? What are the ways that I can do it personally? What are the ways that we can do it as a congregation, that we can share who Jesus is and what he's done? I want to leave you with part of a song. Now, we're not going to sing this song, but I like the positivity of it, and it's one that I know all of you could, take up right away. The song says, there's a message true and glad for the sinful and the sad. And I bring that up because I want you to just notice the positivity of that message. It says it can give us cheer. It can make us happy. Right? It resounds with positivity, and I think that's the kind of attitude we ought to have when we think about how we're going to share good news. It's good news after all. And of course, the reason it's such good news is because God, through Christ, has established a way for us to have our sins forgiven by baptism for the forgiveness of our sins and by faithfulness to Him and His church. Now, the song we are going to sing is that all of that was done through Christ alone. And so, Gord will ask you to lead us in that.